Okay, so welcome everybody to lecture 2 in the politics of religion. Welcome to our new lecture room as well. Never lectured in this room before, it's very nice. Hope we get to keep it. Anyway, so in the last lecture we looked at some of the core issues around the sort of general concept of religion, and the purpose of this lecture is to look at some of the main ways in which religion has been studied, some of the main theories that we can use to understand it. And this is the plan. So first of all, I'm going to start off by talking about something called the religious markets approach. Then I'm going to talk about the idea that religion is used as a form of social control. And finally, I'm going to talk about the view that religion is rooted in aspects of human psychology. And these theories, by the way, are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Like, you can sort of combine elements of them with each other. So as we'll see, for example, one of the popular ideas around religion as a form of social control is that it works in this way because of the psychological elements of religion, right? People are afraid of what might happen to them, in the afterlife and so on, so they behave themselves in the here and now. But there's a lot to get through, so I'm going to just get straight on with it. And the first approach, I'm sort of tempted to say I'm doing these in order of interest. It's a little bit unfair, but this tends to be the least popular approach. Let's try and be diplomatic and put it like that. And this is, anyway, as you can see, the religious markets approach to religion. And this was developed from the 1990s and draws on ideas from economics and, in particular, rational choice theory. So it does have a fair bit of jargon and terminology and sort of things like this. And one of these is the idea that religion operates as a compensator good. And a compensator good is essentially a good that compensates, does exactly what it says on the tin. It's a good that compensates for another good. So the idea here is that if you desire a particular good, but you can't get it, you might settle for a compensator good. A practical example of this might be, if you want to get your hands on a shiny new iPhone, I don't know why anybody would want an iPhone personally, but apparently a lot of people do, but you can't afford it because they're extortionately expensive, then you might settle for something like a Samsung, or a Pixel, or a OnePlus, or something like this. And in that case, the OnePlus phone would be the compensator good. You really want to get the iPhone, but it's out of your reach, so you'll settle for a OnePlus, until you get a job in the city and you become a millionaire and you can buy all the iPhones that you want. And so how this applies to religion then is that the idea behind it is that religion acts as a compensator for everlasting life. And so people would quite like the idea of living forever, quite like the idea of, afterlife being true, but we can't get that, at least in the here and now, but we'll settle for a promise of it later on in the form of religion. So religion comes along and says, hey, we can, if you sign up to our beliefs, then you'll get this thing later. That operates effectively as the compensator good. And because people genuinely like the idea of everlasting life, the rational choice approach argues that the demand for religion in any given society is fixed. There is a certain, as they put it, like a natural level of religion in any given society around the world. And so because of this, because the natural level of religion or the desire for religion is fixed, then changes around religion, so for example if we see a religious revival, for example, or if we see a decline of religion, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, a thing called secularization, which I am going to mention a few times today because it crosses over into some of this stuff. If we see changes in the overall patterns of religion, they can't be caused by changes in the demand for religion because that's pretty static. Therefore, they have to be caused by changes in the supply of religion. And so according from this approach then, the focus is on the nature of the religious market and how dynamic or lack of dynamism that market has. And it's to do with the way in which religious groups try to meet this demand for religious beliefs. So one thing, for example, that the religious markets approach has tried to explain is the difference between levels of religion. I mean, there's a few things that they've tried to explain. I'm not going to go into it. I don't want to, overly create the impression it's a very narrowly drawn topic. It does talk about a fair number of things. But one of the big things that it talks about is the differences in levels of religion between Europe and the United States. Now, as many of you who are, alive may have noticed, the United States is quite a bit more religious than Europe. The United States has very, very high levels of religiosity compared to Europe, where religion has been in decline for, several decades. And so this difference between the two continents is explained by the differences in their religious markets. So the United States has a religious market that's very open, very pluralistic, it's very competitive. There's no official, let's put that in inverted commas for now, state support for religion. And so because of this, religious organisations have to be very entrepreneurial in order to get out there and attract believers and bring people in through the door and get people to sign up to their religious beliefs. And we can see this, in things like televangelists in the United States, send us your money and God will give you all these things. We see it in the mega churches, for example. It's this very kind of capitalistic, entrepreneurial, dynamic form of religion. And this dynamism, it is argued by this approach, leads to higher levels of religious participation. So the situation in Europe, on the other hand, is that the religious market is relatively closed. So many countries in Europe, like the UK, for example, have or have had official state-supported religions, and this means that those religious organisations haven't had to bother, really, going out and trying to attract believers. They haven't had to go out and try to think of new and innovative ways to get people in through the door, because the state just backs them up anyway. So there's a lack of incentive for them to behave in a dynamic and entrepreneurial way, and so they have grown lazy and sluggish, and this has led to declining levels of religious engagement. Now, other research from this perspective has focused on the political and economic effects of religious markets. And so one claim here, for example, which is sort of fairly interesting, is that the dynamism of religious markets is linked to the quality of democratic governance. And so the claim here is that the conditions for a free religious market, right, having a lack of state support for religion, having an open and plural and competitive environment, has spillover effects to the rest of society. So what we see here is that the conditions for a religious free market help to promote things like, a smaller state, help to promote ideas around individualism, all of which are said to be good for a democratic society. And these things also have knock-on consequences for the economy, because the idea here then is that the same kind of effects promote economic growth. You have individualism, you have greater entrepreneurial spirit, you have the free flow of ideas within a particular society, and all of this stuff has spillover effects leading to greater democratic governance and economic growth. Now, the religious markets approach, it will not, I'm sure, surprise you to learn, has come in for a fair amount of criticism. And one of these fairly big problem, really, for the theory, is that the evidence doesn't actually stack up to many of its claims. And so one obvious point here, which, you may have been thinking of at this point already, is that the idea that religious participation is higher in countries that have a dynamic religious market and lower in countries that have a closed religious market might work when you're comparing the United States and Europe, but it doesn't work when you look at countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, where they simultaneously have a very closed religious market. They have effectively a religious monopoly, and at the same time, very high levels of religious belief and religious participation. And you can see similar things. It's not just sort of, Middle East countries. You can see similar things in European countries too. Ireland would be less of a good example now, but let's say 10 years ago would have been a sort of better example of this sort of thing, right? Fairly big religious monopoly, fairly high levels of religiosity. This is not what's supposed to happen according to the religious markets approach. So it's a problem for the theory. A second criticism focuses on the supposed link between dynamism of the religious market and economic growth. And research on this particular topic is pretty split. So you can find studies that will say there is a direct link between the two things. So you have a dynamic religious market, then that does promote economic growth. But then you find other studies that say, actually, no, there's no link whatsoever. And then you'll find another bunch of studies that say the link is actually the opposite. Like this one that I'm showing you here, which is a study by Barrow and McCleary. And what they found was that increased attendance at a place of worship, so if you're measuring the number of people who sort of go to the mosque or go to church every week and so on, increased attendance, which is said to be a sign of a dynamic religious market, was actually linked to lower levels of economic growth, not higher levels of economic growth. And their kind of explanation for it in this particular case was that typically, if you have higher levels of religious attendance in a country, then you probably have more religious influence over a society. And where you have more religious influence over a society, you probably have more laws and regulations governing religious affairs, which will then spill over into social and economic and cultural affairs. This is going to have a negative impact on religious freedom, individual freedom, and is then going to have a spillover consequences to economic performance. So that's another problem. A third issue. I'm going to give you 4, by the way, for those of you who like lists. A third problem for the religious markets approach is the idea that the demand for religion in any given society is fixed. Remember I was saying a few minutes ago that the claim is that there's a sort of natural level of demand for religion in any given society. That's fairly central to this theory. But it's never really explained why that should be the case, right? There's no sort of psychological explanation for this. And I think this particular problem is bound up with the rational choice origins of the theory. Because rational choice theory does a lot of this stuff, right? It's a very black box theory. You have inputs, you have stuff happens, people behave, people process things psychologically, and then they behave in particular ways. And the really interesting thing there is, okay, that might be true, but why do they process things psychologically in the way that they do? What's the mechanism at work? What's going on inside that box? That's the really interesting stuff, and it's not explained here. It simply says, people like the idea of everlasting life, therefore there's a fixed demand for religion, therefore all these other things. Well, okay, people might like everlasting life. I suppose that's true in lots of cases, but it's just assumed. It's never actually explained why this is the case. And it's difficult also, by the way, to square this idea with the rising numbers of people who say they're not religious in many parts of the world, including, as we'll see in later weeks, in the United States. Right? If there's a fixed demand for religion in a society, why are the number of people saying that they don't believe in religion going up? It doesn't look like the demand is fixed. And one final criticism that I just want to explain to you here is to do with... So one of the things that the religious markets approach claims is that religious groups kind of act like firms, or they act like corporations. Right? They're out there trying to get as many believers as possible because you have a dynamic, entrepreneurial, competitive religious market. You try and get the biggest market share that you can. But do all religions act like this, really? I mean, we can all think of some that do, right? You look at sort of, Christian evangelicals or certain, varieties of Islam, for example. But then there's other forms of religion that just don't do this, like Judaism, for example, or members of the Greek Orthodox Church don't typically go around trying to gain converts. In fact, in some religions, they don't even accept converts. You cannot convert, for example, to the Druze. If you're not born into the Druze religion, you can never become a Druze, right? They just don't accept people. So there are certain religions out there that are not trying to get as big a market share as possible, but are actually there to represent a certain sense of identity, an ethnic identity, or a sense of belonging to a particular group. And the rational choice approach doesn't really pick this up. So it's fair to say, I think, that the religious markets approach, has one or two problems. The second approach that I want to examine today is the idea that religion works as a form of social control. And the first thing I think to note here is that this, in many ways, is a sort of folk view of religion. And what I mean by this is it's something that's there in various parts of the literature, and if you just kind of go and read around stuff on religion, you'll pick this up, right? Or if you just go around and talk randomly to people about religion and ask them what they think, then they'll very often come out with things like this. Religion works to control people in various different ways. So it's just kind of out there in the ether, but it's not something that has, like the rational choice approach, love it or loathe it or whatever, but it has a particular research program. There are specific people involved in it. Rodney Stark, for example, Iana Kone would be another. There's a specific group of individuals. They have their own agenda, their own concepts, their own ideas. It's a coherent theory. It's all packaged together nicely. Social control theory just isn't. There's nothing like that around social control theory. There's not a set of concepts that bind it all together. It's just this sort of disparate idea that religion in various ways works to control people. The closest you can probably get to it is in sociology, where there's some stuff out there on the links between religion and crime, or religion and deviant behaviour. But even then, you have to sort of squint a bit to see it in that particular way. But anyway, the core idea of social control theory is that religion allows elites, whether they're political elites or religious leaders, to maintain power and to keep social order by effectively controlling or shaping what people think. And if you shape the way in which people think, then you can control and influence the way in which they behave. And so this is a very long-standing view. I'll give you some examples of this. Machiavelli, for instance, who I'm sure you only got to a third year of a politics degree and not heard of this guy, right? He wrote in his famous exposition on governance, which was The Prince, of course, in 1532, that there is nothing more important for a ruler than appearing to be religious. And what he meant by this wasn't that the elites needed to be religious, because, they're out there having too much of a good time to, pay attention to all of that kind of stuff, but they had to give the appearance of being religious in order to maintain social norms throughout the rest of society. And the idea was that if, the elites didn't give the impression of being religious, then the hoi polloi wouldn't follow the particular religious codes, and then we would just have sort of social anarchy and everything would, break down. For the same reason, the French writer Voltaire famously said, again, this is another one of those quotes that everybody's heard of, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Now, it's a very popular quote, of course, but it's also often misunderstood. So people often think that this quote means that Voltaire is talking about people's kind of sense of meaning, right? Or, the sort of place in the universe. And that if God didn't exist, people would feel some kind of existential crisis and would then need to invent God to give meaning to their lives. Which is a legitimate argument, by the way, but it's just not what Voltaire was talking about. Voltaire, in this particular quotation, he wrote it in a letter, an open letter, to the author, was an anonymous author, of a document called The Three Impostors. And The Three Impostors was a document which was basically attacking Judaism, Islam, and Christianity as being sort of false religions. And it was an atheist propaganda piece. And Voltaire was responding to this by saying that if we didn't have God, effectively social order would be compromised because atheism was a terrible thing, and if you don't have religion, you don't have morality, and therefore you have all these kinds of social problems. Which is another idea that we come back to in a couple of weeks. A third historical example of this, and another one that I'm sure you've all heard of, comes from Karl Marx, who famously described religion as being the opium of the people. I'm not going to read through the whole of the quote. There's a few quotations in this lecture, by the way, that are fairly lengthy. You'll be very relieved to know I'm not going to go through them. But as you can see for yourself, this is his basic, exposition on how religion works. And the idea for Marx, which I'm sure you all remember Marxism from sort of PO 107, right? You have the economic base of a society, and then you have the ideas which kind of float above that society, and they're kind of reflections of the material conditions under which people live. Karl Marx's view was that religion was basically here to convince people to put up with the intolerable conditions of capitalism. So capitalism was oppressing people, were living in poverty, had sort of miserable lives, grinding through work every day and then sort of dying, at the age of like 35, and all these kind of terrible things, horrible diseases and everything else. And one of the things that would make people put up with that, rather than taking to the streets and, having a revolution, was religion. Religion kept people quiescent, kept them quiet, kept them in their place, and thereby was needed to maintain social order. Now, this idea he didn't come up with it by himself, by the way. He got it from this guy. It was a philosopher called Ludwig von Feuerbach. And he argued that the idea of God was essentially a projection of human society. So what Feuerbach argued, it's a similar thing to Durkheim, by the way. If you remember Durkheim from last week, what Feuerbach argued is that human beings took all of the things about their society that they liked. They took all their kind of fear, they took all the values of their society, took all their kind of social qualities, took all their fears, all their desires, all their hopes, all of that stuff, bundled it together, and then projected it out onto the concept of God. So God was an objectification of the thoughts and ideas and various expressions of the society in which people lived. It was kind of like a cosmic bat symbol, right, being beamed up into the sky, into the clouds. That was what God was. People created this concept, right, and then they projected it out into the cosmos, and then they imagined that it was real, and then because people imagined that this idea of God was real, they started behaving as if it was real. Ergo, we get this idea of religion operating as a form of social control. And as you can see, the very famous quote from Feuerbach, the secret of theology is nothing less than anthropology. And then here's the guy I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, made a very similar thing, which I'm not going to read through this quotation, from Emil Durkheim, who's basically saying a very similar thing, right? The ideas around religion, these things that people hold sacred, are the objectified, essential ideas of the society in which they live. It has anthropological and sociological roots. Now, this is sort of, there are lots of examples of this, but these are sort of the basic ideas as to why and how religion would work as a form of social control. Is there any evidence to support this claim? Is this idea that religion works as a form of social control, a sort of objectified super person that reflects back on society and makes people behave in different ways? Is there any evidence to suggest that this could be true? Well, supporters of this approach will typically point towards a number of similar things, and I'm sure you can all think of examples of this, and this is not going to come as a surprise to you that these are some of the main ones, right? So people who talk about religion being a way of controlling people will typically refer to examples of religious violence and religious oppression. So, we have the Christian churches, for example, in medieval Europe, torturing people, throwing heretics in jail, burning them at the stake, having all kinds of, horrible inquisitions, right? It's a pretty good example of religion as a form of social control. More recently, we see it in groups like the Taliban, for example. Again, another really good example of religion as a form of social control. We see it in the United States with Christian nationalism, which again, I'm flagging a few things up. We do get onto this in a bit more detail later on, with reproductive rights and now sort of, the whole sort of Project 2025 stuff with Donald Trump. All of these things look like examples of religion being used to control and oppress people. And so if you're arguing from this perspective, of course, these are the kinds of things that you're going to highlight. So that's one. Another example comes from the way in which religion is used to legitimize certain political orders. And a good illustration of this, which again we talk about in a few weeks' time, the close links between religion and nationalism. And we see here, for example, Narendra Modi in India, for example, with Hindu nationalism. We see it in this particular case, right, the Orthodox Church in Russia being a very strong supporter of Putin and a strong defender of the invasion of Ukraine. And in addition to this, there have been a fair number of studies. I mentioned, earlier on, I sort of alluded to the sociological literature on religion and deviance and crime and stuff. And there is a fair bunch of studies that do link religion as a form of social control in terms of its influence on people's behaviour. So, for example, higher levels of religiosity have been consistently linked to lower levels of drug abuse, lower levels of alcohol abuse. It's been found to have a moderating effect on violent behaviour. It doesn't stop it altogether, but it has a mitigating effect on it. Higher levels of religiosity are also linked to higher levels of social conformity and higher levels of being judgmental towards people who don't fit in the box of societal norms. And so when you look at it like this, you put all these things together, okay, there's some pretty decent evidence, right, to suggest that religion can work in this particular way. However, there are also problems. There are problems with all of these theories, by the way. This isn't, I don't suppose, a spoiler in any meaning of the word, but there are problems with this particular theory as well. And so one of these is, of course, that not all religions work in the same way. So Islam, for example, will, as a general rule, tend to put more emphasis on social regulations, on how people ought to behave, how they ought to dress, relationships between genders and so forth, than, say, for example, Buddhism. Catholicism will put more emphasis on sexual regulations than New Age spirituality, right? So you can't simply go, religion is a form of social control, therefore this affects all religions in the same kind of way, because there are fairly significant differences between different religious groups. So that's one problem. There are also variations within religions themselves. And so we do find, for most religions, you have differences between conservative and liberal wings. So one of the things that's just gone through in the past year, for example, in the UK, is the assisted dying bill, the legalisation of assisted dying. And this was attracted a lot of attention from religious organisations for obvious reasons. Again, this is something we come back to later in the module. But one of the interesting things here is that the Anglican Church, for example, which was one of the more vocal groups on this particular topic, was split on the issue. So conservative members of the Church of England were stridently opposed to legalising assisted dying because they thought it would lead to some kind of dystopian future, the instrumentalisation of human life and all those kinds of things. But liberal members of the Anglican Church were supportive of assisted dying because in their view the greater emphasis here should be on alleviating people's suffering, having empathy with people in very difficult situations and so forth, right? So you find differences of opinion within religions themselves, typically between this liberal-conservative split. One other interesting thing here, by the way, is that when you look at the differences between religious groups, religious individuals, I should say, and non-religious individuals, one of the things that comes out quite consistently there is that non-religious individuals tend to be more politically and socially progressive than religious individuals. However, you can also find on this kind of spectrum of progressiveness, certain religious organisations will be even more progressive than the social average and even more progressive than non-religious groups. Liberal Judaism, for example, for reasons that I just don't know, I can't explain this, but it's there in the literature and it comes up quite consistently, is more progressive than any other group when it comes to issues around LGBT rights and climate change, for example. In terms of public opinion, attitudes towards these things, they tend to be the most progressive. So even then, right, it's not a sort of a clear split between the non-religious and the religious. So all of these things, again, complicate this sort of general idea of religion as a, just a way of controlling people. And thirdly, there are also some interesting differences according to the kinds of God that people believe in. So people, for example, who identify as spiritual but not religious, right? These are people who believe in some kind of higher power or some sort of divine force or divine principle in the universe, even though it's not sort of formalized, tend to score more highly for anti-hierarchical beliefs than people who believe in monotheistic religions. So there's a clear difference there, right? Anti-hierarchical beliefs wouldn't necessarily fit with the view of religion as a form of social control. They're kind of very anti that kind of stuff. Studies have also found, this is a really interesting issue, studies have also found that people who believe in a kind and loving God are more likely to cheat in social tests and social experiments than people who believe in a strong, authoritarian and punishing God. Which you might think is a bit odd, right? If you think God's going to punish you, why the hell would you cheat, right? And so that doesn't sort of fit together. And the argument for this is, of course, that people who believe in a loving God and a compassionate God are more likely to cheat because they think they're going to be forgiven, right? They think, oh, well, I'll do this thing, and if I get caught, then God will just let me off, right? So people who believe in a kind and loving God, people who believe in a disciplining, punishing God, will have very different approaches to how they regulate their lives and how they go about their business. The key point here that I'm making really is that the idea of religion as a form of social control becomes increasingly problematic when we realise that religion itself isn't a homogeneous category and it has all these various complexities and nuances within it. And a final problem with this theory is that religion can also be a tool or an instrument for revolutionary social change. So it's possible to find examples of religion that supports the social order and that, yes, it does oppress people and keep people in their box and all that sort of stuff. But then you can find examples of religion doing the exact opposite. The Protestant Reformation of the 17th century, for example, was one of the most socially disruptive events in human history, caused by religion. Or we can talk about, the anti-slavery movement, which was, religious groups had a high involvement in that. Of course, religion was also used to justify slavery, but, religious organisations and individuals played a key role in the anti-slavery movement. Or the civil rights movement in the United States. Again, religious groups and individuals had a key role to play in that. Or this one here, liberation theology, which was quite prominent in Latin America in the 1980s and was a sort of fusion between Catholicism and Marxism. So if religion can be a way of inspiring people to change and uproot and transform the social order, then the idea of religion as a form of social control doesn't necessarily hold together, right? It becomes increasingly problematic. Now, the final theoretical approach that I want to run through today is the idea that religion is linked to psychological processes. And theories from this perspective see religion as a way of satisfying certain psychological and emotional needs. I'm going to give you some long quotes, but like I say, I'm not going to go through them. So read quickly if you can, or get the slides. The slides are on Moodle. I was being very organised today. I've even managed to record this lecture, unlike last week, where I completely screwed it up, and then had to go and sit in my office and do the whole thing again. Herbert Spencer, for example, who was one of the early kind of academics involved with studying religion. I've kind of put the key bits here in red. Argued that religion emerged from our ancestors trying to elide a sense of order out of the chaos of the universe in which they lived. As you can see here, the first few lines. Things like diseases, storms, earthquakes, right, eclipses. Can't explain these particular things, which is, it's quite worrying, I guess, if you're, living in those particular moments. And so people then start to invoke ideas of religion as a way of explaining this, which brings a sense of order and certainty to their environment. So it brings a sense of psychological calm, let's say. So in this case, then, religion was a sort of form of proto-science. Now, by the way, I'm not going into this today. This is, again, I'm flagging something up for a few weeks down the line. This is quite an interesting idea, the claim that religion is about creating a sense of order and certainty and security. This is quite influential when we get to talk about the concept of secularization measuring the way in which religion declines and how religion works. So I'm just going to kind of stick a little flag in that. Okay, so that was Herbert Spencer making the case that it was all about, ghosts and earthquakes and stuff. Others, like William James, wrote a very influential book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. Again, similar thing. The idea of religion emerged from people's emotions and psychological qualities when they considered notions of the divine, their relationship to there's just something out there. It feels as if there must be something else. This can't just be all it is, And so maybe when we're considering the meaning of life and all that sort of stuff, we have this emotional desire for there to be something, this is where we start to get religious experiences emerge. There are sort of psychological and emotional underpinnings to it. Another psychological approach, this is the sort of last white male individual I'm going to give you for today. This is obviously Sigmund Freud. You've all heard of him, right? And he was a very famous exponent of the idea that religion, in his view, was essentially a form of wish fulfillment, right? It would be really nice, he argued, that to know that there was some kind of celestial father figure in the sky, right? Because everything to do with Freud was about, dad and all that kind of thing. It would be nice to have a celestial father figure, somebody looking out for us in life, all the kind of unfair, horrible things in the world, right, and all the kind of bad stuff that happens to us. Wouldn't it be nice to know that ultimately everything was going to work out okay, that there was some sort of grand plan, that there was, a big daddy in the sky watching out for everybody, and, all that sort of business, right? And so he argued that essentially this is what it was. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than this, because Freud also argued that, deep down we knew this wasn't true, but we really wanted it to be true, so we tricked ourselves. So religion, from this perspective, was a form of wish fulfillment, a comfort blanket, but also at fundamental root an illusion, right? We were kind of deceiving ourselves into believing that this was the way the universe was. Now, nobody really takes Freud seriously anymore for lots of reasons, but one modern variant of this, which kind of carries the torch in lots of ways, is called terror management theory. And this was developed starting from the 1980s, maybe the 1990s, and it argues that religion is a way of dealing with the existential trauma of knowing that we are all going to die, which is a nice thought. And according to terror management theory, religion acts to alleviate our anxieties around this by providing a buffer against death anxiety. And it does this in two particular ways. First of all, by providing us with a sense of symbolic immortality. In other words, if you belong to a particular group, if you belong to a religious organization, you can even transpose this idea maybe onto things like nationalism, right? If we belong very closely and we identify very intimately with a particular group, it's nice to know that that group, that sense of identity, which is bigger than myself, is going to carry on after I die. So we have a sense of symbolic immortality. But more significantly, we have a sense of literal immortality in a similar way to the religious markets approach, that if you follow a particular religion, you're going to have the afterlife, so your fear of death is alleviated by the fact that you're not really going to die. And there is some evidence to support this theory. So there was, this is one from Burke et al. They did a meta-analysis, as you can see, of 164 articles looking at research into terror management theory, and they found that the effect of religion in alleviating death anxiety was, in their words, robust and had moderate to large effects. So you can actually measure this stuff. You can do tests in the laboratory, you can actually get data and you can see, does religion alleviate these things in the way that we think? And according to this study, the answer was, yeah, it does. Another study, this was by Jong et al. I think it's Jong or Yong, I never know how to pronounce it. This found that people who are primed with the idea of death, so this is how these kinds of experiments typically work, right? You get two groups of people in the laboratory and you prime them to think of different things. So you get one group and you give them text to read, and in that text it will have words like funeral and coffin and things like this, right? And so that person will then naturally start to be more drawn to ideas about death. And then you have another group which has all like, happiness and sunshine and stuff. And then you ask them questions afterwards about their religiosity, and more typically you kind of measure how fast they respond to these things. So people who respond instantly, you don't have time to think about it, right? So you're trying to measure people's instinctive reaction to stuff. Anyway, what this study found was that when people were primed to think of death, they were more likely to express belief in things like supernatural entities, gods, ghosts, afterlife, and so on. And interestingly, this worked even for people who professed to be an atheist. So people who came into the laboratory went, no, I don't believe in any of this religion stuff, I'm a complete atheist. Then they go through the test, come out more likely to believe in supernatural beings on the other side. And in addition to this, there is also a fair amount of research into the health benefits of religion. Because if terror management theory is about providing people with a sort of buffer against death anxiety, you can kind of stretch that a bit maybe and say, well, maybe it's a buffer against, the ups and downs of life and the hard knocks that we encounter on the way. And if somebody's religious, they're going to have a sort of way of dealing with all of these things, right? And there are quite a number of studies which show that this is the case. I've already mentioned some of them earlier on, lower levels of drug and alcohol abuse, for example. But there's also things like people who are more religious tend to recover from serious illnesses faster, tend to have improved longevity, tend to have lower rates of depression, lower rates of suicide. There's a whole bunch of health benefits that are linked to ideas of religiosity. However, it won't surprise you to learn there are also problems with this approach. And one of the problems is the evidence for it is mixed. So one of the key claims here, for example, around the health benefits. So it is true, as a general rule, that people who are religious tend to have these health benefits more than people who are not religious. However, more fine-grained research has found that the thing that gives people the health benefits is not the beliefs in the supernatural being and the beliefs in the religious teaching and all the rest of it, i.e. the psychological stuff going on inside their head. It's the social stuff. It's people going out and attending a place of worship. Now, you could argue they're only doing that because they believe in religion, and that's a fair point. But it's the social activities, being around other people, taking part in things, participating, seeing your friends, all that stuff has the physical and mental health benefits, not sitting at home just believing in stuff, right? That doesn't have any health benefits at all. And there is also some evidence on this, by the way, from the pandemic, which was quite interesting, which looked at the links between religion and well-being, and even then the evidence was mixed. So there was one thing which came up quite strongly in the literature, for example, called negative religious coping. And this is where religion can have adverse health benefits, because if you're really religious and then something terrible happens like COVID, a lot of people will think, why has God let this happen? Or why has God let these things happen to me? Does God hate me now? Has God abandoned me? I've been religious all my life, and now all of a sudden I'm affected by these horrible things, right? And so that can then give people a sense of greater depression than if they just didn't believe in God in the first place. So that's one issue. Another one was that a lot of the research around well-being in the pandemic found that people who dealt with the pandemic better in terms of their mental and physical health were people who had a positive attitude regardless of whether or not they were religious or non-religious. That was kind of incidental. It was your positive frame of mind and your kind of, yes, this is going to be in the end okay, we can get through it, we just have to keep, soldiering on. That was the thing that had the health benefits. A couple of other things on this, I'll just do it really quickly. Just on the health benefits point. Statistics also show that the least religious countries in the world tend to score higher on a range of quality of life indicators. You can see here, this is looking at the United Nations Human Development Indices. And as you can see, the top of the list, we've got Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, Denmark, Germany, Sweden, Austria, Hong Kong, the Netherlands. And of these countries, most of them are not particularly religious. Denmark, for example, has high levels of nominal belief. There's people who would say, yes, I believe in religion. So I think, let me see, I wrote this down there. 71% of people in Denmark are church members, but then when you ask them what they actually believe, it drops to just under a third, right, 28%. So not many of these countries are particularly religious. And you get a similar result when you look at this, which is the World Happiness Report. The top countries here, as you can see, Finland, Denmark again, Iceland, Sweden, Netherlands, Costa Rica, so on. Of these countries, maybe like if you take the top 10, you probably go, what, Israel, Mexico, Costa Rica. Those would be the only ones that would be sort of predominantly religious. So on a national level, there doesn't seem to be any obvious connection between religiosity and well-being, and that could be a problem for terror management theory if you're trying to make this link between having a psychological buffer against the ups and downs of life. So it could be a problem, but it depends. So I'm skipping through this because time is slipping away. You could sort of say this is evidence against the theory. On the other hand, and again, this is another sort of flag for later on, right? So just kind of bear this in mind. You could look at this and say, actually, this provides evidence for the theory. Because if you look at the countries at the bottom of the World Happiness Report, right? You've got Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, Lebanon, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Congo, Yemen, so on and so on and so on, right? These tend to be highly religious societies. And so you could sort of flip the argument around here and you could say, well, maybe one of the reasons why these societies are so highly religious is because they feature so low on the list of human development indices and they score so low for happiness. They live in societies that are, riven by poverty, insecurity, corruption, have all these sort of social issues going on. And so to that extent, is it a surprise that people in those conditions are religious if we think religion is a way of providing people with a buffer against various problems in life? Okay, so that's one problem. A second problem with terror management theory is that religion can work the other way, right? I've already sort of mentioned the idea of negative religious coping, and this is a similar thing because if the claim is that religion helps people deal with death anxiety, what happens when religion increases people's death anxiety? And there have been numbers of studies which have found this to be the case, right? So if, for example, you're a highly religious individual, maybe you're worried as you approach the end of your life, what's going to happen to you afterwards, right? Maybe you're concerned that you're not going to get into the good place. Maybe you're worried that maybe, you've done a few things in life that, you shouldn't maybe have done, and that's now going to be held against you on the kind of balance count when you die. Maybe you're going to end up in hell. Maybe something horrible is going to happen to you. And if you have those religious beliefs, then the idea of death could be increasingly scary from a religious perspective. So studies have found that from some instances, religion can actually elevate death anxiety rather than reduce it. And a final couple of things here, just on the state of the evidence. This was another study by Jong, which should be on the reading list. They looked at over 200 studies into terror management theory, and their view was that it was basically a mess. Right? The evidence is all over the place. You can find studies that show these things are true. You can find other studies that show it's not true. You can find other studies that just kind of go, I don't know, nothing really going on here at all. The whole thing is, in their words, is it's a chaotic picture, and there's insufficient evidence on the basis of the empirics to draw any firm conclusions about the relevance of terror management theory. And finally, a study by Ellis and Wahab made a very similar point. As they put it, they were frequently astounded at how inconsistent research findings were on the topic of religiosity and fear of death. So on the empirical side of things, terror management theory has a few hurdles to overcome. And on that bombshell, I am going to leave it there for today. So next week, we're going to be talking about the links between religion and science.